You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This is part 3 in the series called Your Own Moral Compass, which is about methods for identifying independently for yourself your own ethical code and the difference between moral and immoral rules. So, big topic, and I've done a couple of podcasts on this already, part 1 and 2. As a very, very brief recap, what we've covered so far is the ultimate purpose of morality as being rules of shared behaviour that allows us to live together peacefully within the context of scarce resources. So rules that enable us to live together without fighting over things. That was in part 1. And in part 2, I talked about some criteria for identifying rules that would enable that kind of peaceful coexistence. And the criteria were that the rules need to be about enabling peace. They need to be universal, applicable to everyone. They need to be logically coherent. And lastly, it needs to be possible to say them without contradicting yourself. Or another way of saying that is actions speak louder than words. So your behaviour in proposing moral rules is more important than what you say. And if your behaviour contradicts what you say, the behaviour trumps what you say. So in this episode, I want to talk about what some rules are that actually fit all these criteria. I want to give some examples of what a valid moral rule actually looks like, as opposed to a fake moral rule or invalid one. But before I get into that detail, I want to just say a few words in response to some of the feedback that I've had about the episodes so far. I really appreciate all the feedback, and I've had some really nice, encouraging emails from people saying that they're interested in this subject, and that's been great to receive. And also some really interesting questions and feedback. And one of the questions was, if you're going to have criteria for moral rules, then what's the criteria for selecting the criteria? And isn't this just like ultimately recursive? Couldn't you just go back and decide like what's the criteria for the criteria for the criteria? And I think that is a great question because, where should these criteria come from? I mean, is it really just stuff that we just decide on a bunch of stuff? I mean, isn't that just the same as pulling a bunch of criteria out of your ass and saying, like, here's what I think is a good idea? And I haven't really had time to go into it in a lot of detail, but the point that I want to make here is that the criteria that I've outlined aren't arbitrary. They're not just like, here's some stuff that I think is a good idea. All these criteria are actually implied by what it means to have peaceful communication, what it means to try and persuade by argument, because human communication is based on logic. We use logic to communicate. That's irrefutable because if you try and disagree with it, you're going to use logic to try and disagree with that argument. So if you use peaceful communication, you try to communicate with somebody else, you're using logic. Therefore, any moral rules have to be logical to be part of peaceful communication. The same goes for universality. When you make an argument to someone, the nature of its persuasiveness depends on it being an argument that could, in principle, be accepted by the other person. So inherent in making an argument that is trying to persuade everyone of how to live peacefully together is universality. It's implied in the nature of a peaceful argument. And saying that, you can't make a moral rule that you yourself contradicts is just really, again, follows from the basic rules of logic, that you're actually communicating by your actions what your argument is as well. And so in order to make a coherent argument, a rational argument, you have to be saying something that doesn't contradict yourself either in terms of formal logic or in terms of what your actual behavior is. So these criteria aren't just arbitrary. They're to do with what it means to communicate peacefully. Now, in order to explain that, I'm going to take a little step back and talk a little bit about where morality comes from. This is something that is a huge issue of interest and research. And to cut the story extremely short, moral rules and the use of moral rules is a behaviour, a human behaviour. And like any behaviour, if we want to understand how a behaviour comes into being, we have to understand it within the context of evolution. Evolution is the explanatory framework that we have for how we got to be here as people and what we are as humans. And it's the only framework that enables us to explain how we get to be here as complex, ordered beings from a universe that's full of randomness and entropy. It's the only framework that doesn't involve invoking a god or something that sits outside the system that is ultimately just pushing the question further back to say, well, how did that entity get here? So evolution is the framework that we have for explaining how we got here as human beings. And morality is a human behaviour. So in order to understand it, we need to try and identify how it could have arisen to give us an evolutionary advantage. And again, as a reminder, what we mean by morality is shared rules for peaceful coexistence. So rules that enable us to live together in peace without fighting over scarce resources. So what's the benefit of living together in peace? Well, the benefit of living together in peace comes from the division of labour. Basically, for any individual, living with other people peacefully enables you to benefit from an economy where you have individuals specialising things and people cooperating on joint tasks together and all of the good stuff that has led ultimately to where we are now, but even started in very, very primitive societies in terms of, people hunting together and dividing up hunter-gathering duties, then in agriculture, working together. So the division of labour itself is an incredibly powerful benefit. If you are able to make the division of labour work, you get great benefits. And so there's an evolutionary advantage for those humans who are able to get along, communicate with each other, and work together peacefully, cooperate, basically, as opposed to fighting. And that's how come we got to have morality. We had the brains evolved to the point where we could use our brains to communicate with each other, live together peacefully, cooperate with each other, and reap the benefits of the division of labour. And the longer we were able to do that, the more resources we were able to gather, and the more each individual benefited, passing on their genes, evolving, and so forth. That's where morality comes from. But that's also where immorality comes from, because just as there are benefits to the division of labour, there are also benefits to taking stuff aggressively. There are benefits to war as well. The division of labour tends to be long-term benefits. So in other words, it takes time to cooperate together, work together, and achieve all of the benefits that you get from the division of labour. And those benefits are huge, but they're long-term. There's also an evolutionary benefit of ripping people off in the short term, taking what you want by force. So we are all also capable of warlike or aggressive behaviour, because we have the ability to do that, and there has been in history an evolutionary benefit to that. And unfortunately, there's still an evolutionary benefit in the sense that it still pays off to a certain amount in the short term to be immoral. If it didn't pay off to be immoral at all, there wouldn't be immoral people out there. It's clear that the division of labour doesn't work with immoral people. If you undermine trust and cooperation within an economy, then you ruin the division of labour. And so ultimately the benefits of peace are the division of labour, but the benefits of war are that you get to take stuff and have it in the here and now without having to do all the hard work of working together, building up trust, cooperating, and so forth. So we're capable of both moral behaviour and immoral behaviour. The benefits of moral behaviour objectively outweigh immoral behaviour in the long term. And we can see that from what the division of labour brings us, all of the economic progress and growth that it brings us compared to what war brings, which is just destruction. Unfortunately, in the short term, there's a choice to be made between being moral and being immoral, because there are benefits to trying to be immoral. Crime does pay in some circumstances in the short term, even if crime doesn't pay long term in the way that the division of labour does. So that's where morality comes from. So you've got peaceful ways of interaction, you've got warlike ways of interacting. And if you interact peacefully, then you try to persuade, whereas if you interact in a warlike way, then you just take. Now, if you do interact peacefully, though, you're using communication and persuasion. You're using communication and persuasion to try and get agreement amongst people. And that itself has its own internal logic. Communication uses logic and reason. Logic and reason are like the maths underlying peaceful communication. And just like maths, if you want to say something coherently to try to persuade with the use of logic and reason, then you need to follow the rules of logic and reason. So to bring this back to the criteria for moral rules, they're not just made up in the sense of just like, oh, here's a bunch of criteria I think would be a nice idea. They're criteria that are inherent in what it means to communicate peacefully rather than to take aggressively. Now, I am covering a lot of ground, so if you have questions or thoughts about that, I'd love to hear them. But that's a very brief comment about where the criteria for moral rules come from and where morality itself ultimately comes from. But what I really want to do in this episode is to give you an example of what a moral rule looks like. And essentially, there are really only 4 basic rules that fit the criteria that we talked about for enabling peaceful interaction between people in the context of scarce resources that are universal, logically consistent, and you can say them without contradiction. There are really only 4 rules. These 4 rules themselves also aren't just pulled out of thin air. They're actually implied in the logic of peaceful communication too. And for that reason, what I'm about to go through in terms of these 4 rules are actually rules that everyone who wants to be logically consistent would have to accept in order to be consistent. Now, that doesn't mean to say that everyone will accept these rules, but anyone who wanted to be consistent would necessarily agree these rules because they're inherent in peaceful communication. Let me explain the rules and then you'll see what I mean. So there's 4 rules. And by the way, these 4 rules together comprise what's become known as the non-aggression principle. But the non-aggression principle is actually comprised of 4 interrelated and logically connected rules. Each one sort of logically builds on the previous one. So the whole principle is ultimately based on the first rule, which is the most important of all. So let's talk about these 4 rules. As a reminder, what we're talking about is rules that would enable me and you and everyone else to live together peacefully within the context of scarce resources. And scarce resources are anything that are limited in number, that we could potentially fight over. So the most important first thing to look at that we could potentially fight over is our bodies, our own physical bodies. And so we need a rule which is who's allowed to do what to physical bodies, who should be in control of the scarce resource of my physical body, who should be in control of the scarce resource of your physical body, and so forth. And the only rule with regard to physical bodies that fits all the criteria of being universal, logically consistent, capable of being stated without contradiction, and so forth, the only rule that fits all that is to say that human bodies should be under the exclusive control of the mind that's inside the body. So my body should be under the exclusive control of my mind, your body under the exclusive control of your mind, and so forth. And that means I can't do anything to your body without your permission. It's you're the one who controls what gets to happen with your body, and the same goes for me, and so forth. And as a corollary of that, I get to do whatever I like with my body as long as it doesn't interfere with your body, which ultimately means as long as I don't physically aggress against you, try and control your body in some way, I can do anything I like with mine. Or to put it more correctly, more universally, you can do whatever you like with your body, except if it aggresses against somebody else's body. That's the most fundamental moral rule that there is. It's the rule that outlaws slavery, and it's the core of the non-aggression principle. And the interesting thing about this rule is that you can't argue against it, because it's actually inherent in peaceful communication to recognize each other's exclusive control of our bodies. So any argument that I make to say, well, I shouldn't really be the one who controls my own body, I'm controlling my body to make that argument. And I'm actually making the argument to you. I'm assuming if we're having a discussion that you're going to be able to use your body to either agree with me or discuss with me this question. So it's actually something that you can't argue against because you would just logically contradict yourself. So that's the most fundamental rule. As a brief aside, one of the things that people often get confused about on this first rule is to say, well, what about children? Because you see, children, the parents actually own their children or control their children. So this rule isn't really universal because, see, children are controlled by their parents, and the parents are sort of like their owners because they produce them. And the short answer to this is that parents don't own their children. They have a position of custodial care for their children. If we're to apply this moral rule universally, then children own their own bodies. They ultimately are the rightful owners of their own bodies, and they ultimately are the ones that rightfully have control of their own bodies. However, being born vulnerable and incapable of exercising control over their own bodies and of sustaining themselves and of dealing with the complex world around them, their parents have a custodial duty to look after them and provide them with a sort of trustee care of their bodies while they're in a position where they're not able to take care of themselves. Now, what exactly constitutes a trustee care, and what are the boundaries of what parents should and shouldn't do? Well, that is a big topic and an important one that we could do a whole another episode on, but I just want to make the point that this rule does apply to everyone, and in fact it's using this rule that allows us to show that some behaviours of parents towards children are immoral. Like, so to abuse a child physically, sexually, or in any way is actually breaking this moral rule, because you are violating the child's just and proper ownership of their own body. Now, there's a lot more that we could say about that, but that's a basic explanation of rule number 1. Rule number 2 logically follows from rule number 1. So we've already established that I can do anything with my body. So now let's look beyond the body and look at physical resources out there in the world and talk about how we can have rules for who controls those that are in line with the first rule that we already established and with all of the criteria that we established for any rules. So the second rule is a rule that looks at who should be the rightful controller of any resource that is currently not controlled by anyone. Now, there's not many resources in the world that are unowned these days, so this rule doesn't come up as much as the other ones, but it's still a really important one. Here's an example of the second rule from everyday life. Just think of going to the beach. Everyone who goes to the beach understands this basic principle, which is the first person to claim an empty bit of beach is the rightful controller of that bit of beach for the day. You can put your towel down there, you can put your stuff out, and do what you like there, as long as you don't actually interfere with somebody else enjoying their piece of beach a little bit further along. And the same applies when you go to the park. You know, if you're claiming a bit of ground in the park on a sunny day, everyone understands once you're sitting there, you've claimed it until you choose to leave. And everyone who interacts peacefully intuitively understands how this rule works. Now, in the case of parks and beaches, you're not taking control permanently. It's just like a temporary so-called homesteading of use of that piece of ground. But the same rule applies for anything unowned that you take control of without depriving anybody else. That's the principle in action. There are less examples of permanent control using this rule because there are less unowned things these days in the world that you can take ownership of. So we have to imagine scenarios where this could apply, but it still would apply for any unowned resource. So just imagine that you're at sea and you come across a desert island. Somehow this has evaded the Google satellites. Somehow nobody's come across this before. And you're the first person to set foot on the island. Who owns this island? Well, according to this rule, if you're the first person to make this island your home, demonstrate that you're actually taking possession of it by putting up a little fence around it, big flag at the top that says my island, then you are the rightful person to take control of that scarce resource of that island. And the idea behind the rule is that if you're not just taking it away from anyone else, then you're not creating conflict in doing that. Nobody else has got ownership of it, so you're not depriving anyone of anything. So you can take possession of this island without anybody else being worse off. It's like a net gain. There's not a win-lose situation. It's just you winning and nobody else is losing. And the same goes for any unowned resource. This rule is called the homesteading principle. It was first talked about in detail by the Enlightenment philosopher John Locke. And although it doesn't apply that much these days because we don't come across a lot of unknown stuff just out there, it's still a really key principle. And it logically follows from the ownership of your own body. Unowned resources rightly belong to the first person who takes control of them because they're not creating any conflict with anyone else by doing so. Nobody else is losing out. And any other situation, let's say it's the second person who comes across this resource, if they were to own it, well, they would automatically be in potential conflict with the first person. So it's the only rule that actually fits all the criteria. And it's an objective rule. We can all agree it's universal and so forth. So that's the second rule. The third rule is pretty straightforward and just follows, again, logically from the first two rules. Anything that you create by transforming existing resources that you control, ultimately, logically belongs to you. So the person who produces a new scarce resource by recombining existing resources and creating something new is the rightful owner of that scarce resource. Because by doing so, they're not depriving anybody else of anything. They're not creating any conflict. They can control that resource without disturbing the peace, so to speak, without coming into conflict with anyone else. So let's say, for example, that you own a bunch of planks of wood and some nails and some tools, and you bring together those scarce resources to create something new, like a chair or a table or some piece of furniture. Then who should that scarce resource be controlled by? Who should be the rightful owner of that scarce resource? And if you made it, then the rightful owner should be you. And applied more universally, the rule that allows for avoiding conflict when it comes to producing new scarce resources is the rule that says that they should rightfully be controlled by the person who made them. Now, it's interesting as a side note to point out that this rule applies to scarce resources. So what we're talking about is things that are limited in number that we might end up fighting over, individual items. So it doesn't apply, for example, to ideas. And this is why intellectual property, even though it's called property, doesn't fit within moral rules. Intellectual property, the idea that you own the ideas that you produced because you made them, is applying the moral rule about owning things that you produce to something that's not scarce. An idea isn't scarce in the sense that I can know a recipe that you invented and I can cook the food with that recipe without depriving you of your recipe. It's not an idea is not a scarce thing. There can be as many copies of an idea as you like, and nobody is deprived of the use of the idea in the first place. That's, again, another big topic, and I do have a couple of episodes about intellectual property, which I can put links to in the show notes. But that's just a side note to say that this rule about the rightful owner or controller of newly produced scarce resources being the person that made them doesn't apply to things that are not scarce within this framework of how to create valid moral rules. But according to this framework, intellectual property is totally bogus, immoral, and doesn't fit within the non-aggression principle as defined by this framework. So the fourth rule logically follows from all of the first three and is compatible with all of them as well. And the fourth rule is simply that any scarce external resource that you already control, either because you've made it yourself or because you've homesteaded it because nobody else was using it, you can choose to give that away to somebody else and give them control of it voluntarily. And you can either give them that as a present, or you can choose to do a trade with them where they give you something else in return. But any voluntary exchange of ownership from one or control from one person to another fits within this framework. Because if you are the person in control of it, then it follows logically that it's your choice if you choose to give up control to somebody else voluntarily. And if you choose to do that by agreement of trade or as a present, that's all totally valid. So those four basic rules are what comprise what we call the non-aggression principle. They're ways of interacting with other people about scarce resources without coming into fights. They're rules that enable us to get along and have clear, objective, impartial ways of determining who should control what, that we all know in advance, we're all able to act on, and allow us to get along peacefully. And if you think about these rules, these are so basic and simple. Even children understand these rules. Children understand that hitting each other is wrong, that they control their own bodies and that it's wrong to aggress upon another person's body. Children understand that the first person to pick up a toy and use it is the rightful person to control that toy until they're not using it anymore. And then they give it up and then somebody else can pick it up. Children understand that if they make something, they made it and it's theirs. And they also understand that you can trade and give each other things and that that's okay too. And everybody has an intuitive understanding of these basic rules for peaceful interaction, even though there are both confusions about these rules and deliberate attempts to subvert them. So there are some people who are just confused or ignorant about exactly how to behave peacefully, and there are other people who are not ignorant but are just simply lying or deliberately subverting these rules, acting outside these rules. And that brings me on to another really important question that I got asked about these podcasts about morality, which is, how can we get other people to be moral? How can we get other people to stick to these rules about how to live peacefully together? And the answer to that question is you can't. You can't force anyone to be moral. It's generally accepted that you can't get an ought from an is, and I agree with that. You can't make anyone act in accordance with moral rules, and there will always be people who don't act morally, partly for the reasons that I talked about earlier on, that there are advantages to aggressive behaviour. There are advantages to trying to get stuff from other people by force, even though they're short-term advantages and they are outweighed by the long-term benefits of the division of labour and peaceful interaction. There are always going to be people who want to take the shortcut to getting stuff by simply preying on others. So you can't make anyone obey these rules. But that doesn't change the fact that there are some moral rules that facilitate and enable peaceful interaction based on objective principles applicable to all. And in that sense, there are some rules that work for peace and there are others that don't. The point of talking about this is to understand them yourself is incredibly important as a first step. And the reason it's very important is because it means that you limit the exploitation of yourself that is possible. There's different levels of immorality. There is basic immorality, and then there's immorality that involves mind games. When it comes to basic immorality, what I'm talking about is somebody who's simply immoral in the sense of just simply being somebody who mugs you, like a thief who stops you in a dark alleyway and says, "Give me your money or else I'm going to stab you or shoot you," or whatever. That is just straightforward basic immorality. That thief is not attempting to morally justify their actions. They're simply using force and the threat of force to get you to comply. Dealing with those people is a purely practical question. How do you avoid getting mugged? How do you avoid your house getting burgled? What precautions can you take? What security can you use to protect yourself? How can you locate yourself in places where the risk is lower and not go into dark alleyways, and so on and so forth? These are practical concerns that we all have, ideas about the best way of protecting ourselves. But there's no debate here with people who are just basically immoral. It's a practical question of how do you avoid those people from ripping you off as much as possible. And, you don't need me to tell you about what kind of locks to put on your door or which dark alleyways not to walk down. These are all practical concerns that everyone is capable of coming to their own conclusions about the best way to defend yourself against the basically immoral. But there's another level of immorality, and that's immorality with mind games. So that's the kind of thief or exploiter who doesn't just say, "Give me your money or else," but who says, "Give me your money," and wants to try and make you believe that he's not a thief or that he's not an exploiter. And that's the most dangerous kind of immoral behavior. Immoral with intellectual or moral arguments, trying to hide the immorality. These are the most dangerous people because they confuse you and they prey upon the natural desire to live peacefully and morally and do the right thing, fulfill your obligations in life and so forth. They prey on all of these moral sentiments, so to speak, in order to do exactly what the basic thief does, get resources from you. And the people who do this, most of all, are people who call themselves the state. Politicians exert power over you and also try to get you to believe and indoctrinate you to believe that they're still moral. It's also bad parents are the other people that do this. Bad parents are often people who exert these kind of moral arguments. They do abusive things to their children, but they also tell their children that it's for their own good, or that it's the right thing to do, or that the children asked for it, or all these kinds of arguments. So to come back to the question that I got, which was, how do you get other people to obey these moral rules? You can't force anyone to be moral, and there will always be some people who are immoral. They're basically immoral, just the thieves of this world. Protecting yourself against them is just a practical question. You got to put locks on your door and not go down dark alleyways and all that kind of stuff. The other kind of immorality is people in positions of power who abuse moral arguments to try and hide aggressive behavior, aggressive acts. And the key thing about that is, if you are confused by those moral justifications, then you may be defrauded of money or resources or your own freedom or anything else because you believe that somehow the aggression perpetrated against you was justified. It's absolutely vital that you are able to determine for yourself whether or not any of these justifications are valid. And that's why I've gone from absolutely first principles to talk through what morality is in the first place, what it's for, what the criteria are for moral rules, what valid moral rules look like, so that you yourself can take any arguments made, go through and decide for yourself, okay, well, how does this actually work? How would this be applied? And so forth. There are people in the world who are open to reason, who are able to be persuaded by reasoned argument about how we can live together peacefully and what the shared behaviours would be that would enable us to do that. And those people are teachable. You may be able to reason with them. For the people you can't reason with, you just protect yourself against. And protecting yourself against common thieves is at least straightforward. It may not be easy, but it's at least clear what you need to do. Protecting yourself from sophisticated intellectual thieves, like politicians or bad parents, is much harder because you get the mind games on top of the exploitation. This whole series has been about providing fundamental principles so you have your own moral compass so that you don't get confused. And then you can look at how you can protect yourself more effectively. And you may not be able to protect yourself against all of the exploitation in this world, but at least you'll know when you're getting ripped off and you won't be confused by it. So that's why I've gone through all of these principles. I did want to go through a whole series of examples of ways that people try and cheat moral rules and provide examples from people in positions of power like bad parents or people in the state for how they do this. I think this episode is probably getting to be long enough, and so I could do another episode if you are interested in running through that. But you've also got all the principles to work this out for yourself. I will put some links in the show notes also for additional material and where I'm getting all of this stuff from. I've tried to present these ideas as simply as possible because a lot of stuff that's written on morality is not exactly easy reading, and there's a lot of confusing terminology used and stuff that I don't think is very clear. But I will put some links in the show notes. The most useful of all that I've found for explaining, in particular, these basic rules that comprise the non-aggression principle is a book called The Economics and Ethics of Private Property by Hans Hermann Hoppe. And I'll put a link in the show notes to that. It's actually available for free online. So if you're interested, you can also read about this stuff for yourself. And I might do another episode at some point going through how people try and cheat the rules as well. But I hope that gives you some interesting food for thought. I'd love to hear your feedback. Let me know what you think. Does this make sense? Do you have some other points or arguments that you think are important to make? I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you have feedback about the show, please email jake@thevoluntarylife.com. If you enjoyed this program, please share the podcast with your friends or click the donate button on thevoluntarylife.com.